Well, good afternoon, Emma. Thank you for joining me today. You are a Fresno State graduate, yes?
Mhm. Yes, I am. Yeah, I
And
got my bachelor's at Fresno State. Yeah,
great. And now where are you studying?
I am at Texas Tech University, and I am a doctoral student in their Human Development and Family Sciences program.
Wonderful. Thanks for agreeing to talk to me today. And I would like to talk to you about a study that I know you worked on about commitment trajectory clusters. So maybe you can start by telling us, just in really general terms, what is this study about and what are you looking at?
So, I am really interested in how premarital pregnancies affect romantic relationships. So, the goals of my study were to examine each partner's commitment to marriage and how it was affected by premarital pregnancy. And then I wanted to look at commitment trajectories, effects on the progression of relationship milestones and later marital outcomes. And then I wanted to explore whether premarital pregnancies led to poor relationship outcomes later in the marital relationships, and if other factors could potentially contribute to premaritally pregnant couples' relationship failure or success in their marriages.
That's a lot.
Yeah, it was a big goals.
And what had prior research found about issues like this?
So typically when we look at research on premarital pregnancies, it tends to paint a really negative light for couples who experience a premarital pregnancy. We typically find poor relationship outcomes, poor communication, high levels of negative affect between the couples, eventual relationship dissolution or divorce. And so I wanted to look at, okay, well, is it the pregnancy that's causing this, or are there other factors that could be influencing this? Because oftentimes when we look at the broad strokes of the research on premarital pregnancies, it tends to kind of paint the pregnancy as the main cause of these problems.
Right.
And I didn't believe that. So
I
that
see.
kind of led to, yeah.
Great, thank you. Would you tell us about your sample, where you got it, what kind of people you studied?
Yeah, so I used a secondary data set. I used a data set from my advisor, Dr. Sylvia Nehus's data on the newlywed study. So she recruited newlywed couples who had been married for about 6 months in West Texas. They were mostly Hispanic couples, and I think she had a data set of about like 200 couples total. But then I specified my data set to only include premarily pregnant couples. So couples who experienced a pregnancy before they were married. And there was certain criteria that they had to fit. I specified couples who had a live birth. And then sometimes the husbands would report that there was a child born to them, but then the wives wouldn't. So we just kind of were like, okay, maybe he's making something up. So we ended up with a sample of about 50 couples, and most of them were Hispanic.
Great. And do you know how your advisor found these folks in the first place?
Oh, yeah. So she looked at marriage records that were available at the courthouse. I think she also did advertisements through local newspapers. She went to bridal shows.
Okay.
So she reached out to the community, but I think most of them came from courthoch records.
Neat. And then she would reach out to them and say, I saw you got married last year. Would you be willing to? Okay, yeah.
And then very much more formal letter, but yeah, it was hey, I heard you got married. Do you want to do the study?
Great. And then the other thing that's kind of unusual from the perspective of HDFS about your study is that you have data from both the man and the woman in the couple.
Yes, it's really exciting.
Yeah.
And she has continued the study to 3 waves of data. We just collected our 3rd wave. So we still get to interview both couples. And
Nice.
we like to interview couples separately because then we can get their individual perspectives of their relationship. That way that they don't, because sometimes when you interview them together, they kind of influence each other,
Right.
and sometimes they'll make it seem better than it is. So we like to isolate them and get the real information.
Great.
Get the whole story.
And then in terms of, you said you did interviews. Do you also do questionnaires? What's what do you do with them when you get them into a wave?
Yeah, so we first collect demographic information from them, and we usually do online surveys. In the past, back in like 2009, I think is when we first started collecting data. We had like paper surveys that we would give them, but now we have Qualtrics, which is nice. So yeah, we would do a survey with their demographic information, just general relationship milestones, checking their commitment trajectories for the first wave, and just general relationship survey questions. And then we'll bring them in and interview them, ask them about their relationships thus far, ask them about their commitment trajectories again, and see where they're at.
So wonderful. You're using this term commitment trajectories. Could you give us, say, an operational, maybe a conceptual definition and also an operational definition of that?
Yeah, so commitment trajectories are, the way that we define it is the probability of, I like to think of examples like how would I actually ask this person if they're in my lab. So they come into the lab, we ask them, what is your likelihood at this time point that you will marry your partner? And oftentimes when couples will come into our lab, we'll ask them about their dating relationship. We'll ask them, how long have you dated? And we'll mark when they started dating to when they stopped dating. And we'll say, okay, at this month in your dating relationship, what was your likelihood of marrying this person?
Oh, they did that retrospectively, though?
Yes, we did it retrospectively.
The first time for their whole relationship. Got it. Yes. Okay.
Yeah, so couples can say 0%, there's no way I was going to marry this person, to 100%, I was absolutely going to marry this person, nothing was going to stop me. So commitment trajectories are a way of measuring the likelihood of marriage throughout the relationship.
Got it. Okay. And it is, so conceptually it's the likelihood of marriage, and operationally it's data collected retrospectively where they put a percentage on it, and then you track that thing out, you graph it over time, and that is the trajectory?
Yes, yeah.
How neat.
Yeah,
How
that
neat.
tracks it over time.
Yeah.
There has been a couple studies. Catherine Sura, she does commitment trajectories prospectively. So as they're dating, she'll bring them back into the lab to do.
See. Okay, so in this study, which I think is kind of between groups comparison, you're going to compare people in different groups. What are the three groups that you looked at?
So we used our commitment trajectories to kind of make the basis of our group. So we had three groups, and one of the groups was husbands and wives had a rising commitment trajectory, but the wives had a higher overall commitment when compared to the husbands. Our second group was husbands and wives rising, but they had similar levels of commitment. So they were kind of on the same wavelength, is a fun way that I like to think about it. And then our third group was husbands and wives, and the husbands had a higher absolute level compared to the wives. So their level of agreement across their commitment trajectories was the kind of difference in what made the group difference.
Right. And when you compared these three groups to each other, what were some of your findings?
So we found that couples who had similar commitment trajectories, they typically met relationship milestones like living together, getting engaged, saying I love you first, quicker than couples who had dissimilar commitment trajectories. So the group where the husband had higher levels or the wife had higher levels, they took a little bit longer to reach those milestones, while the couples where they were on the same page, they met those milestones much sooner.
Can you tell us what you mean, like how you operationally defined satisfaction and maybe more importantly, disillusionment? Because maybe we all know what satisfaction is, but...
So marital satisfaction is how satisfied they are overall with their romantic relationship and their partner. And I used a questionnaire, I think it was the marital opinion questionnaire. And so we had couples rate on a scale of like 1 to 7, I think it was, how much do you agree with each word? And it was opposing words. So on a scale of 1 to 7, how would you rate? Would you say you're more miserable, or do you find this relationship more enjoyable? So describing their marriage and their partner through that kind of lens.
Okay. And it's specific to relationship satisfaction. This wasn't life satisfaction. This was relationship. No. Could you tell us the results with satisfaction, how they were different across groups?
Yeah. So overall, couples with similar commitment trajectories, so the group 2, where they were on the same page, they had higher levels of marital satisfaction. Specifically, the men reported significantly higher levels of marital satisfaction when we compare them to the men in groups 1 and group 2.
I see. Mm-hmm. All right. No surprise. That sounds like you'd expect it. Tell us what disillusionment is.
So disillusionment is, the way I like to think about it and the way I describe it to my students in my class is it happens when you start your dating relationship and you kind of think that your partner is the best thing since sliced bread. You look at them through very rose-colored glasses, and then you get married and you start to realize that they leave their socks around the house. They maybe don't pick up the trash as much as you'd like, and you're starting to realize that the person you looked at in a very romanticized view isn't what they're all cracked up to be. And once you're married. So it's, the way it's defined is in a great sense of disappointment in your relationship and your partner.
I see. Okay. And how did you operationally define that?
So we used the marital disillusionment scale, and we asked participants with like 16 items, and some of those items include my marriage hasn't gone quite as perfectly as I thought it would, or our relationship has changed for the worse. And they rated that on a scale of 1 to 5, with 5 being extremely disagree to 1 being extremely disagree to 5 being extremely disagree. I think one of the questions too was like, if you could go back in time, if I could go back in time, I would marry my partner again.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
So intense questions.
Yeah. All right. Well, tell us what you found with regard to disillusionment in these 3 groups.
So our couples who had similar commitment trajectories, so group 2, they had lower levels of disillusionment, but in particular, the wives reported significantly lower levels of relationship disillusionment when compared to the wives in groups 1 and groups 3. So
again, they're kind of doing great. They were on the same page to begin with, and it shows up later in this regard.
Yeah, so they seem to be on the same page throughout their dating relationship, and it's showing up again in their marital relationship.
All right, so I'm seeing a pattern. The blue graph, when men wanted the relationship more, they're actually not that satisfied, but they're also not that disillusioned. It's like exactly what they wanted. They got exactly what they wanted, right?
Yes, they did.
Women are not feeling that great about it.
Yes. And then for the husbands who had the lower absolute level, so the ones that like were dragging their feet kind of the whole time.
Yeah, so this is the red bar, right?
Yeah, they were not satisfied at all.
It's not, oh, yes, okay. They're not satisfied, but they're also not terribly disillusioned either.
We found support for commitment trajectories to have in-group differences and then between between partner differences. So there's variations between partners and how they understood the commitment trajectories of their relationships, but we also found that couples are going to differ in their groups. So our understanding of commitment is going to not be homogeneous, but it's going to be heterogeneous across couples. And we also found that couples with primarily pregnant couples with similar commitment trajectories had the highest overall levels of commitment and showed faster relationship progression when compared to other primarily pregnant couples. So there may be some support for commitment trajectories and the progression of relationship milestones contributing to later relationship satisfaction and relationship
So not all premaritally pregnant couples are going to experience it the same way. That if you look at something like commitment, you start to see that there's big differences in those paths. Yeah.
Yes, so there may be
Okay.
differences between premaritally pregnant couples, and those differences could potentially lie in their commitment trajectories,
Yeah.
and other relationship variables, like when they reach relationship milestones.
When you named the kind of goals of your study, you were very interested in following, the impact of premarital pregnancy on relationships. Can you make conclusions about the impact of premarital pregnancy itself?
No, I cannot. But what I can say is that when we are looking at premarital pregnancies and how they could affect romantic relationships, maybe we should expand our understanding of the relationship and look at other relationship variables like commitment trajectories and relationship satisfaction and relationship milestones, because those could also help us understand the relationship, but it might not speak to the effect it has.
Right. And looking at subgroups within that group is a really great first step, because you introduce that there's variability, and so maybe we shouldn't be looking at that group of people like they're all exactly the same. So it's definitely a step in that direction, I think.